And we are recording today. Make sure that everybody has an opportunity to see this. Some folks had conflicts today, so we appreciate those that did not join us. But as I said, welcome to Dallas. My name is Peter Davis. I am a professor at SMU in the Sport Management program, and also have worked with Snodgrass Partners for some time. So I'm excited to extend a welcome from our extended SMU campus today, and we're excited to present the Snodgrass Partners Intercollegiate Athletic Tuesday. This is our first webinar in a series, certainly not our last. We've got the next 5 weeks, next 5 Tuesdays scheduled, and maybe even beyond that. We hope to have opportunities beyond that, and more to come in the days and weeks ahead on that. So I've been lucky enough to work in collegiate and professional athletics in a number of different varieties, number of different capacities over the last 2 decades. And I never get tired of the competition that we see on the field, on the ice, on the court, on the course, or whatever playing surface we're using at the time. But at the same time, I find something very unique about collegiate athletics and athletics as a whole. And that is, while that fierce rivalry is taking place, there are often times when the rival administrators are sitting side by side, assisting one another with any variety of questions, problems, concerns, or needs. And in that same vein, Snodgrass Partners is an executive search and consulting firm that has a strong focus in the intercollegiate athletics industry with great depth and breadth of talent that all come from that industry. Snodgrass Partners helps their clients to develop strategic research, audit, and growth plans and set athletic departments up for success. At the same time, Snodgrass Partners understands that there's no way to be everything to everyone. And because of that, Snodgrass Partners has developed an incredible grouping of allied partners, other experts and consultants in the athletics field. And together, there's an opportunity to cover any of an athletic department, athletic department need that may be out there. So today's featured guest is a founder and leader of one of those allied partners. John Schucke is joining us in Colorado today, I believe about halfway between Denver and Colorado Springs. And if I look back on my last 10 or 12 weeks and had a chance to relocate, I think John's neighborhood maybe one I would have looked at along the way. Would have been a good place to hole up for a couple months, as it now turns out. I had the great pleasure of meeting and working with John while we were both at the NCAA in the mid-2000s. And although we worked for very different groups within the NCAA, we did have the opportunity to collaborate and work on opportunities for student athletes from time to time. So I'm really glad to have him here today as someone I've known for well over a decade at this point. But as a former football student athlete, John, and also intercollegiate athletics administrator, John is no stranger to competition, certainly no stranger to the world of college athletics. But also as an attorney, he fully understands how to navigate very complex situations and issues, and also how to develop strategic paths to success. So today, John's company, which is Forward Progress, focuses on issues surrounding APR, graduation rates, and NCAA academics. He's a leader in the academics field, NCAA academics field. I might go so far as to say the leader in the NCAA athletics field or academic field. And regardless, he's assisted a tremendous number of schools and universities in reaching academic revenue distribution benchmarks and avoiding NCAA APR penalties. So today he's going to take us through some steps that schools can utilize in pursuit of beneficial APR and graduation rates, particularly given the world we're living in right now, which is quite different than any of us have ever considered, either personally or professionally. So as we move through the material today, if you have questions or comments you'd like to be addressed, I'd ask you to use the Q&A buttons on your screen, and I think you can move them around, but they could be anywhere on your screen. But find the Q&A button, and I'll try to monitor that and be able to deliver and shuttle some of the questions and comments toward John as we are going through the presentation. We've got a lot of people on the line today, so I can't promise that we'll get to all of them, but we want to hit a majority of them. And if there are follow-ups necessary, we'll certainly provide our contact information at the end to make sure you have that opportunity to do so. But in the meantime, we'll do our best to get everybody's needs as we wrap up about 3/4 past the hour today. So with that, I will say, John, welcome. And the trackpad is yours.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Let me start sharing my screen here. Okay, so again, thank you so much, Peter, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. We were anticipating up to 100 people here today, and we really appreciate the turnout for our first and what will be a great webinar series. And before we get started, I just want to note that I realize that a host of factors are making these times some of the most difficult times that our colleges, universities, and administrators have ever faced. And I hope that you are all doing well physically, mentally, spiritually. And hopefully this webinar, I realize it's APR and grad rates, which can be a fairly dry topic, but I hope it provides a brief respite from the current situation and a few tools that you can take back to campus and use and hopefully help your university. I also want to thank the SMU Sport Management Program and Snodgrass Partners for getting the webinar series off the ground. I'm really proud to be the first speaker. I'm not sure if that was part of the grand plan that Peter had going, but I'm proud to be the first speaker in what looks to be a string of great sessions that will occur here throughout the summer. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, SMU and Snodgrass. And without further ado, let's jump into things if we can. So this is just a quick overview of what we'll be covering in the webinar today. As Peter mentioned, the Q&A chat function is enabled. So please chime in at any time with questions you might have. There's no question too basic or too complex. We're here to serve your needs. I tried to anticipate what your needs might be, but there may be things that I'm not covering or not covering in enough detail for you. We also did receive questions from several of you beforehand, and I know that Peter has those teed up for the appropriate time. So as those come up, those might also answer some of the questions you might have. And as you can see, after providing some background, I've divided the presentation into kind of 3 levels, if you will: basic, intermediate, and advanced steps. And I will warn you, I did assume a baseline understanding of APR and grad rates, given who we thought the potential attendees would be. So I apologize to the uninitiated in the APR and grad rates, as some of this may go over your head, but we just didn't really have time to do an APR 101 type of presentation today. So let's just quickly talk about Forward Progress. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting or working with, I wanted to just give you a quick background on myself and Forward Progress. As Peter mentioned, at Forward Progress, we're actually the only consultant group out there that focuses solely on NCAA academic work. And while a lot of our recent work has been focused on helping schools meet those academic distribution benchmarks, we still assist schools with general APR issues, penalties, improvement plans, as well as eligibility certification, reviews of academic support services, and so on. Basically anything involving the intersection of academics and athletics. Myself, I'm a former director in the Academic and Membership Affairs Department at the NCAA, and our staff consists of people who have experience in the national office, as well as conference offices and on-campus compliance and academic staff members. So bring the whole breadth of experience to our clients. And this was just complete coincidence, but I'm very excited to share that this week was our 7-year anniversary. We started the company on June 1st, 2013, and we're 7 years in and still going strong. So we're pretty proud of that. So let's jump into it. First, I want to share or start with a quick review of the academic revenue distribution. And while I'm not going to say that people didn't care about APR and grad rates before this program was put in place, let's just say it's put a different focus on these rates and we tie revenue to it. Not to be cynical, but people start paying attention when the dollar signs come out a little bit more. As we all know, the distributions that were scheduled to be given out just this week were obviously reduced dramatically due to the cancellation of the men's basketball tournament. However, there is some good news. First, the good news is that was slated to be the smallest distribution of this 13-year period. So that's on the far left, at least on my screen here, 1920 of the $55,000 per school distribution is obviously the smallest one. But the larger silver lining is that Kathleen McNeely, the CFO of the NCAA, appeared on a webinar last week and stated that assuming we do have an NCAA men's basketball tournament next year in March of 2021, and frankly, if we don't have an NCAA men's basketball tournament in March of 2021, there's probably larger issues that we're all facing. But if we do have that in March of 21, the distributions are, including the academic distribution, should be back to normal for both next year and beyond. And so those numbers that you see starting in 2021 all the way to 31, 32, we should expect at least the pot of money there should be the same. One important item to note is the amounts on this slide here, year by year, were based on original projections from the NCAA. So for example, the $111,000 distribution for each school next year will likely be less. And the reason it will be less is that the more schools that earn what we'll call an academic unit, the smaller amount each school gets. It's still not a check that anyone will be sending back to the NCAA. And as you can see, as we get further down the line, we get into some very substantial sums of money for a lot of our Division I schools, especially in these uncertain budgetary times. And frankly, for a lot of the schools, and I know a lot of the schools that I work with, receiving one of these units is much more attainable than receiving a men's basketball unit for making a tournament and then also perhaps winning a game. And so these are much more within the grasp of a lot of our schools in Division I. And finally, it's something that our academic and compliance people can actually point to revenue generation as part of their skill set, which is not something that compliance and academics folks have had to frankly care about in the past. So all that hard work obviously was hopefully noticed by your athletic directors, but now we can actually even point to some dollars coming in. All right, let's quickly here just talk about the distribution and how it works before we talk about some tips. For any people that have worked with Forward Progress, this information, if you're paying any attention, is going to be review for you. However, I think for everyone here, it's important to put this conversation into the context a little bit when we're talking about academic rates and what we're actually shooting for. The thing to remember, and again, for those who I gave this presentation on campus and I gave it to your coaches, I said, if you walk away with this presentation with any information, it's this slide. And I will say that probably the same thing here as well. But there are three ways a school can earn an academic distribution, and those metrics reset every year. So if you don't make it this year, it has no bearing on the next year and vice versa. First is this average single year APR of 985 or higher. How this works is we take every team's single year APR score and divide by the number of teams we have. Fairly straightforward math. What this does for our coaches and for our student athletes is it puts a huge stress on our smaller roster sports. For those of you who are initiated with the APR, you realize that our smaller roster sports, their APRs are more volatile. So if someone would happen to be ineligible on a team with only 4 players on scholarship, they can have a huge impact. For example, we worked with a school that had a team with only 3 student athletes on scholarship, and they had a student athlete leave after the fall ineligible. At that point, the best APR that team could post was an 800. Well, try to average the 985 with an 800 in it is very difficult. You have to have a lot of teams, and a lot of teams getting 1000s. And so, but what we do when we work with schools is we tell them that's the number we want to shoot for every year, because if we do well in that number, the other 2 will follow suit. The second way to earn the distribution, and I should mention, you don't need to meet all 3 of these. Any one of these 3 will do to get a school to the distribution benchmark, is the NCAA's graduation rate of 90%. So the GSR, graduation success rate. The nice thing about this rate is that it removes transfers from your cohort if they leave eligible. So you bring in a student, they leave after a year with a 4.0 and transfer wherever they might go. It's like they were never there for the graduation success rate. However, it also takes into account transfers that you bring in. So if you bring in a two-year college transfer, four-year college transfer, they're added to your graduation success rate cohort. The tough thing about this benchmark is that 90% is a very high number, right? So it leaves very little margin for error. For example, if you have very few sports on your campus, you might have 50 people in your cohort. So if 4 of them leave ineligible over the 6-year period, you're below 90%. And so it can get tricky that way. Pardon me, if more than 5 leave ineligible. And then finally, is the federal graduation rate that is 13 percentage points higher than the student body. The federal graduation rate, unlike the NCAA's rate, does not take transfers into account. What I mean by that is if a student athlete were to come to your campus, spend a year there, again, leave with a 4.0, transfer wherever they might transfer to, the federal government considers them to be a dropout for this rate. And as we all know, this is not reflective of Division I transfer reality. And so it tends to impact we're seeing, frankly, a decrease in federal graduation rate for our student athletes compared to the student body because of those transfer regulations.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I've got a question, and I'm going to read it specifically so I don't miss it, from Eric. He says, will a spring student athlete who has returned for a second senior year due to COVID-19, will that student athlete be included in an institution's 2021 APR cohort if the student athlete receives 2021 aid, even though the student athlete's aid is exempt from financial aid limitations?
Great question. Love it. Short answer is yes. So if a student is back on athletics aid, even if that aid is exempted, they are included in the APR cohort, similar to how you would treat someone who's on medical, for example, medical red shirt right now. While their aid may be exempted from your team limits, they're still included in your APR. Same thing holds true for our students who are coming back for that second senior year, if you will, for due to COVID-19.
Thank you. Are you seeing any trends on how schools are meeting the distribution benchmarks right now?
We are, and frankly, it's very interesting. I was able to actually attend an NCAA presentation recently, a webinar where they shared the most recent data, and what we're seeing is a very strong trend in the federal graduation rate. The percentage of schools using this third prong, Peter, to hit the distribution benchmark is going down quite rapidly. And I think, frankly, that is just a function of the federal graduation rate not allowing for transfers. So you could have very high APRs because the students who leave with above a 2.6 GPA and transfer immediately. And we won't get into too much great detail about APR policy, but you can have high APRs and high GSRs, but a low federal graduation rate. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing more schools using that first prong, frankly, paying attention, which is great. They're hiring folks like Forward Progress to help pay attention to sports that were doing fine before, right? Your men's soccer team, if they were sitting at a 975 APR in years past, they were in no danger of being penalized. The motivation for especially a small compliance shop to go track down maybe a student who left because of a medical issue and you needed to get documentation was fairly minimal, right? There was not a lot tied to that. Now, as we see the money coming in, there's that motivation to really reach for these high scores versus avoiding low scores. And so we're seeing the number 1 prong go up and the number 3 prong go down. Good question too. All right. So let's talk about some basic things you can be doing. Again, these are tools that you can be using on campus to be tracking APR and grad rates. For those of you that I work with, again, the beginning of this should be review. And so something that hopefully is going on if I'm doing my job correctly as your consultant. But first, basically just some kind of low-hanging fruit. First is determining what your mid-year APR status is. And these are things, frankly, you'd be doing outside of a COVID-19 environment, right? Hopefully. Your mid-year APR at this point should be pretty much set. We're sitting here on June 2nd. You may have a couple of potential APR adjustments hanging out there, but your basic eligibility and retention outcomes from what happened in the fall have been decided. So you should have calculations for each team done, as well as an overall APR average for the athletic department. That's going to help you determine, are we tracking on this 985 APR average or not? You're now able to input fall data into the academic portal. That's a relatively recent phenomenon that the NCAA has allowed us to do. Used to be everything had to happen in the fall semester when you had a million things going on. And I'm sure it will be no different this fall, if not exacerbated. So you're able to input your fall data now into the academic portal, save yourself literally half the time come October. And by calculating the mid-year APR, you'll know what needs to happen in the spring and summer, right? Spring, for most of you, unless we have, I know we probably have a couple quarter schools on the line here, but for our semester schools, spring semester has passed. But it may have been maybe too late now, but you could have used, for example, retroactive financial aid. It was an APR tool in our two-belt to add some students to financial aid to kind of offset. So especially in our equivalency sports, if you have room in your limits, adding students to aid will, for the APR equation, add more numbers to your denominator. And so it, again, helps with those volatile sports. Use an example of a client who I won't call out here. We've been going through this process over the last couple months, and they added several students to aid in one sport to get them from a 984 to a 985, at least as they project right now. And for them, they spent somewhere in the range of about $5,000 on financial aid to then in turn get a distribution of about $100,000. So pretty good return on investment these days to get that. The second thing you're going to want to be doing, and again, I apologize if this is too basic for some, but and this for my clients is something we've been focusing on for a couple of years at this point, but grad rate data was due yesterday, June 1st. Every year, grad rate data is due June 1st. This year was no exception. And there are two things that are key with this data. First, you want to make sure that the cohort of students that are listed there actually lines up with what it should be. The good news is it was due yesterday, but you have until July 1st to make corrections. So you can go in if you find things are wrong. And I will tell you, with over half of the clients we reviewed this year, we've found inaccuracies with who was in the grad rate cohort, which is a little bit scary because that data is pulled from the APR data. But we found, for example, grad transfers were not listed as grad transfers, and therefore they were included in your graduation rates, which they are not. They should be included in their undergraduate schools' graduation rates. Or we had people that, for whatever reason, their enrollment data in the APR was wrong. So it said they enrolled in 2014 when in fact they enrolled in 2013. That would put them in the 2014 grad rates instead of this year. And so little things like that. But when we're talking about a 90% rate, and like I said earlier, the margin for error being so small, getting these cohorts exactly right is key. The second thing you want to be doing with the graduation rate results is actually looking to see if you made the distribution benchmarks. Again, for our clients, this is something we've been doing. The nice thing is the Fed grad rate, the FGR, is very easy to figure out. All you have to do, for my compliance and academic folks who at least have access to it, is go to the academic portal, go to the reports tab, and then choose institution report. Doesn't matter if it's the public or private one. There's going to be a column that says FGR for student body 1314, FGR for student athletes 1314. If the student athletes are 13% or higher, you get the distribution. You can count on that, give or take, $100,000 check coming your way on June 1st, 2020. It's nice to know, again, as you're planning budgets, we're going to get that check. And as we get down the road and think about $400,000, $500,000 checks, really going to be nice to know almost a year ahead of time that those are coming. Calculating your single year GSR, not as easy, unfortunately. So that same report where you find the FGR differential, that 13% or higher, there's going to be a column that says student athlete graduation success rate. And the logical thing to think would be, that's my number for the distribution. It is not. Please, please, please don't use that number to feel confident you are going to meet the distribution. The reason being that number that's posted on that report is a 4-year APR, meaning your last 4 years altogether, what's the percentage? So it may say 90%, but your most recent year could be 88. And it's factored in with another year that had 92, another year that had 91, or whatever the case might be. Instead, you have to manually, at this point, the NCAA hopefully will fix this, you have to manually calculate your GSR for just the 13-14 cohort. We don't have time to walk through how that's done, but if you want to know, feel free to reach out. Cost-free. I'll gladly shoot you how to do it, but I can walk you through how to do it. Give me a call, shoot me an email. But it's something that, again, don't rely on that report for the GSR, just the FGR. I think I saw a question come in, Peter.
Yeah, there's one. Why do they do the single year APR calculation differently for academic distribution?
Good question. Very good question. It's one of those, like I mentioned off the top, I've been away from the NCAA for 7 years. And there are few times when I think, oh, I wish I was back there. I enjoyed my time there. But being privy to those conversations would have been one of those times when I wish I was back there.
Nice.
What I've heard rather, is that they didn't want any one sport to dominate, right? So if you were to take all of your student athletes and combine them together and figure out a department APR that way, and you have football is going to make up a larger percentage of your APR score, right? If you have 85 student athletes, let's say, or whatever it is on football scholarships, and you have 6 on golf scholarships. And so football would be, in that case, 14 times more important than the golf team when it comes to APR. So they went the other way, in that now it's every team's worth the same when we get to this averaging. And so now it puts the pressure on those those smaller roster sports. I think what I've heard through the grapevine is that there was concern from some of the football playing schools that if we did the calculation where football, every student athlete's worth the same, football would drag down some of those schools and they wouldn't meet the average or would have less of a chance to meet the average. And so with football just being one score versus the sum of its athletes, that was part of the reason it went that direction.
Thanks. Can schools still access the single year GSR on the IPP app?
They can, yeah. So you can, is my understanding, however, that's not out there until the GSR is made public, which is in the fall. So if you want to know your GSR now, it's my understanding, unless things have changed in the interim, that you'll want to do the calculation yourself because the IPP is not populated until you have schools you can compare yourself against. Another good question. We have the this is not the 100 level classroom. This is good.
That's good. Excellent.
Okay. Let's take the next step then, if we can, to kind of intermediate steps. So if we have a good handle on what our current, or at least mid-year status was with APR, we want to start projecting for the fall. And this is really where the current environment, COVID-19 environment, can wreak some havoc on the APR, because our campus reopenings are a fluid situation. I'm sure all of you, like myself, keep up with D1 Ticker or whatever you might read, and see that it's going to be varying from school to school, municipality to municipality, region to region. So it's going to be tricky. Luckily, the NCAA has been, as I would say, and not just because they're my friends back there that I worked with, I think they've been pretty nimble in this regard. And they've given us some tools to work with as campus administrators and consultants to alleviate what could be some catastrophic outcomes going forward. First is that the NCAA is allowing schools to self-apply progress towards degree waivers. I can't overstate how important that is. If a student athlete's ineligibility can be linked in some way to COVID-19 in the estimation of the campus, it's crucial to note then, for APR purposes, receiving a progress towards degree waiver or PTD waiver is the same as being eligible. You still earn the APR eligibility point. You can click that box on the APR, and that student does not lose you an APR point. This is going to be the first line of defense in saving your APRs. And I think our seasoned compliance folks know this. It's not going to require review by the NCAA of your thought process. However, you will be required to have a recovery plan showing that how the student athlete will recover from whatever deficiency they might have that's making them ineligible. But that is going to be our first line of defense. The second line of defense, and what's going to be likely trickier, is going to be issues of retention. So there's going to be student athletes in a situation where they're ineligible and they don't come back to school, or they're eligible and they don't come back to school. In either of those cases, as it currently stands from the NCAA and the Committee on Academics, is you're going to need to submit an adjustment request to the NCAA demonstrating why the student athlete was non-retained, or demonstrating why they're ineligible, or both, and the impact that COVID-19 had on that student athlete's ineligibility, the impact that COVID-19 has had on their ability to be retained at the school. And this is where you should be gathering documentation now. Now, you won't be submitting APR data until October, most of you, but gathering documentation now on June 2nd and throughout the summer is going to make it easier when that comes around. It's going to make it easier for you to project confidently what your numbers might be. So if you have student athletes that fall into either of those camps, either they're ineligible and not coming back, or eligible and not coming back, you're going to want to work with that coach and that student athlete to get a statement about, again, what the case might be. It's important to note that every APR adjustment is very fact specific. So, and decisions that are made by the NCAA staff are tied back to the Committee on Academics APR adjustment directive. So that's what they use in their analysis. But so, for example, if you're arguing that a student athlete did not return to campus because he or she had a parent that was diagnosed with COVID-19, the NCAA is going to want to see, likely want to see contemporaneous medical documentation. And for those compliance folks, probably nodding their head when they hear that those three words are definitely a buzz phrase in our world. Contemporaneous medical documentation, meaning contemporaneous to the time they were diagnosed. We need documentation showing the diagnosis, showing that to be the case. Again, very fact specific. You might have, you might be located, for example, if you're a university in New York City, you might be located in what would be considered a hotbed of COVID-19 activity. Who knows what August and September hold, but that may shift to other cities or hopefully go away. But you may have a host of student athletes in this boat. And so gathering the documentation to show the NCAA as we submit those adjustment requests of why these student athletes didn't come back will be very important. All right. And then I'm going to shift here now to some advanced steps.
John, but before we run there, what if there's an international student athlete that has decided he or she's afraid to return because of COVID? I mean, does that change anything in any way? Being, you know, can I receive APR relief in that case?
You can. So if we have an international student athlete, and this is a very real possibility, either they're afraid to come back, or they're in a country that has, you know, very strict travel guidelines, and they're afraid if they come to the U.S. and might not be able to come back to their country for a while. And you think you couple that, Peter, with some of our more heavily international student athlete centered sports are smaller roster sports. So you think of men's and women's tennis, golf. There's a very high risk of APRs falling precipitously. So you're going to want to be tracking on these. So yes, if those students either are too nervous to come back, or they are faced with travel issues from their own home country, you will need to be submitting those to the NCAA, no question. And that's something that I would encourage everyone to be doing, having those conversations, using whatever means you might have necessary to leverage getting that documentation. That could be an assistant coach, could be a head coach, could be a peer on the team, because those students are literally halfway across the world. And especially if they're not coming back, you really hope the coach didn't burn a bridge on the way out. because that will make it that much more difficult to get a statement. All right, so let's talk then about some advanced steps. And really what this is now is we're getting beyond reacting to the here and now. So the first step was, where were we coming into the semester? The second step is, where are we now? What tools do we have to adjust to what's going on here in the current environment? What's the NCAA allowing us to do? Now I want to take it another step further to talk about what are we going to do next year and the year after and the year after and the year after, especially as those numbers go up for the distribution. As you can recall from that earlier slide, the numbers rise pretty quickly over the next 5 years, and then they plateau. The dollar figures plateau for several years, about 7 years, at around $500,000 per school per year, give or take. And so it would be really silly to not be thinking about what needs to get done in future years, right? And so first, it's important to keep in mind how the process works for graduation rates. This may seem scary to some of you, but for example, the cohort of student athletes that arrived on your campus last fall rather, so fall of 2019, that student athlete cohort is going to impact the distribution that you receive in June of 2027, which may seem like a really long ways away, and it is a very long ways away, and who knows what the future holds. But because it's a 6-year window to graduate and a 1-year window to report that information, there's a lot of projecting that we can be doing along the way. So I encourage wholeheartedly schools to be doing data analysis. And what I mean by that is who is losing APR points for us? Who is hurting us with the grad rates? For example, in the grad rates, and I had this happen to a couple of clients recently, and it was kind of too late to do anything about it. They had student athletes that were pretty good students, baseball student athletes, not valedictorian of the class, but also not close to being ineligible, who got drafted after their senior year. So they played 4 years straight, no redshirt, get drafted after the senior year, had about 6 credits left to graduate. Well, for our APR gurus out there, you know that student does not lose an APR retention point. If they left to go pro right away, we don't lose the APR retention point. However, grad rates are different. Even the GSR and as well as the FGR. If a student athlete exhausts their eligibility, they have to graduate. So they had 2 baseball student athletes that were, again, 6 hours away, went to go play, making their way through the minor league system, but during that 6-year window didn't graduate. In fact, one of them came back 6.5 years after they enrolled and graduated in December of 2019, too late. And so be tracking on those students who may not have lost you APR points, but they're going to impact you in the GSR. And again, with those small cohorts, one student athlete can make the difference between having an 89% and a 91 when it comes to meeting that 90% benchmark. So always be thinking, are there ways we can expend a small amount of resources to bring these students back to campus to graduate, which will hopefully pay off with a distribution from the NCAA. Great thing too about this too is you can use the NCAA Degree Completion Fund to bring these student athletes back. It doesn't even have to be out of your pocket necessarily to be bringing these student athletes back to campus. Even if it's like that example I gave before, where a school spent $5,000 to make $100,000. You could be doing the same thing 5 years down the road, spend $5,000 to make $500,000. Compliance folks will look like financial wizards with that. Want to bring us back to the current situation as well. Again, I know I talked about projecting out. One thing that's very important to me noting as you are projecting, and something we'll be working with our schools with in the fall as we have a better sense of what's going on, is if student athlete leaves your school ineligible, which we're going to have, even if you get an APR adjustment for that. So let's say you have a student athlete who leaves your school ineligible, you submit an APR adjustment in the fall, the NCAA approves it. They are not going to be considered leaving eligible for graduation rates. So again, this is a little bit of a 200, 300 level type analysis, but think about those student athletes that were freshmen this year. They didn't successfully finish the spring. They don't want to come back to school for the fall. You get an APR adjustment to not lose the APR point. You still need to be tracking on them as losing graduation rates points. That may change. The NCAA may say, hey, we're gonna tinker with the GSR and allow you, if they got an APR adjustment, to count them as left eligible. I highly doubt the federal government is going to do that, though. And so we're looking at student athletes that are going to impact your graduation rates 3, 4, 5 years down the road. So all the more reason why it's important to be projecting right now to know where you stand. I think I saw a couple questions pop up.
Yeah,
here.
John. First one, we'll go with maybe the quicker response first. John, can you review the retroactive aid statement that you made earlier?
Yeah, so the NCAA allows schools to provide retroactive financial aid to student athletes. Now, this is subject to several caveats. One is your institution has to allow for the issuance of retroactive financial aid. There are also scholarship limits in play. There are also Title IX considerations in play when we talk about giving scholarships. However, NCAA rules will allow you to provide a scholarship to a student athlete if you do it by the end of the spring semester. And what you can do is make that aid retroactive. So essentially what you're doing in that situation is you are adding that student athlete to your cohort for both the fall and spring semester by giving them aid in the spring. And so when you do that, again, in those smaller roster sports, this is much more difficult than a head count sport situation where you're limited to the number of scholarships you have. By adding those students to retroactive aid, you can in some ways pad your numbers, if you will.
All right. How about any recommendations for how to phase adjustments for 11th and 12th semester students who did not graduate?
How to phrase adjustments for students who didn't graduate?
Yes.
Okay. So if we had a student who was in their 11th or 12th semester this year, unless they had received an extension, they would not be in your APR. And I may not be understanding the question correctly, but unless they received an extension, they would not have been in your APR. Or if they were a graduate student, they would automatically earn the retention point, at least for this year. That changes next year. And so you could, if you had a graduate student who was in that 6th year, or someone who got an extension was in that 6th year, it would be the same analysis. You'd have to submit the APR adjustment and talk about the impact of COVID-19 versus those students who are coming back to campus this semester. And you can submit or self-apply the PTD waiver. Thank you.
Amanda, if I did not get that right for you, we'll have our contact information at the end here, and you can reach out to John or me directly. Eric had one. I told him he's going to test my ability to read. It's a long question. It's a good one, though. But the COVID-19 PTD self-applied waivers, he's saying, could create a domino effect with eligibility and retention. If an institution self-applies a waiver to render a student athlete eligible in the fall of 2020, will that student athlete need to be completely caught up in terms of eligibility by the end of fall 2020 in order to avoid losing APR eligibility point for the 2021 academic year?
Good question, Eric. So short answer is I'm not sure. What I know is they have to stick to their recovery plan. What I would suggest everyone's going to have that recovery plan. What would be most likely, and I'd have to kind of think through a hypothetical, and Eric, I'm happy to handle this question one-on-one as well, is you may have a situation where the deficiency that the student athlete is dealing with just is so large that it can't be made up in one semester. However, it's more likely, whether they're not meeting their percentage towards degree, the 40, 60, 80, or if they're not meeting 18-hour rule, that sort of thing, that can be made up in one semester. And so it's unlikely you'll have a situation where they can't make it up in the fall and get back on track. But what I do know for sure is that if a student doesn't stick to the recovery plan, at least as the NCAA has stated at this point, they're not likely to provide relief going forward. unless we see a continuance of the current, environment, COVID-19 environment.
All right. Let's see, let me do one more here, and then I think we're up against our time. But there are a number of questions out there. So if we're not getting your questions answered, again, our information will be available, and we also have your information to be able to reach out to you. So Leslie did follow up on the statement from earlier. And does it have to be for both fall and spring, or one term only, the retroactive aid?
I believe it could be for just one term only. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
The bigger impact is going to be for both, but if for whatever reason it would be just one term, again, assuming your financial aid offices allows you to do that, assuming it's within NCAA legislation for limits and such.
Okay.
Last thing I wanted to hit on, Peter, and then this was it, was just, and I think it ties into all the questions people are asking. When it comes to APR this fall, undoubtedly, some of you are not going to be meeting these grad rate benchmarks, either the 90% or the plus 13 from the student body. And so to get that $100,000, give or take, check from the NCAA come next June, you're going to need to be at 985. And so I just implore you to analyze and address all lost APR points in the fall to determine whether there's a path to recovery. We're going to wait to see what comes out of the Committee on Academics summer meeting, virtual meeting. But my intuition, having been in those rooms and followed this more than most, is that we're going to see some leniency coming to the APR adjustment directive. The NCAA, I think we've seen it in other areas. We're starting to see it even on the academic side, that there's some common sense leniency going on. And so with adjustment requests, I think it's going to be the same way. And so don't let the reason you don't receive a distribution be complacency. Submit those adjustment requests. I realize that many of you are one-person compliance shops and may not have the time and or the expertise to submit what might be a successful request. But with that, I guess I can segue to my contact information.
Yeah, absolutely.
And feel free to reach out to me.
Excellent. I'm going to pull up my screen here for a moment, and I will share here. And I just want to run through real quickly and say thank you, immense thank you, John, and to all the attendees today for participating with us. I wanted to also share that we've got, clearly this was a big subject because we've still got questions coming in that we'll help answer later. But we've got a number of different opportunities coming up over the next 5 or 6 weeks, and I think 6 or 7 or 8, maybe even 8 weeks. And we'd love to have you come back and join us for another session. That being said, not every session is going to be identified and targeted for you as an individual. So if you do see something on here that doesn't fit you, if you share that with your colleagues inside your athletic departments, we'd certainly appreciate that. We want to get as much good information as we can out as quickly as we can. Next week, we're going to talk about leadership in ambiguous scenarios, which I think this summer qualifies as ambiguous in far too many ways than we'd like to count. But Jeff Moore from Moore Leadership, he also happens to be a former Division I national head coach or national champion coach, will be joining us to speak. And that's, again, same bat time, same bat channel next week. Registrations will be open for that later today. And then, as I say, we go week to week. Right now, we've got the big buzzword on July 14th of NIL and student athlete compensation coming up as well. But I promised that we'd have our contact information here. So certainly you can reach out to me at SMU. You can reach out to Snodgrass Partners for a broader range of thoughts and questions. And then many of you already know John, but for those of you who don't, I think I can speak for him to say he'd be happy to take your phone call or accept your email and call you back and figure things out. So with that, I would like to say thanks to everybody, and hopefully this was positive for you. And if you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, or advice for us in the future, please don't hesitate to share that with me, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time, and have a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. Be safe and be well. Thank you.